This is part 2 of my video series on how to draw a realistic face. In the previous part, you learned how to draw this sketch from a reference photo. In this part, you will learn how to draw the skin and the nose. And in next week's tutorial, we will move on to the eyes. So subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss it or any of the other parts, because I will post one part each week. But for now, let's start drawing the skin and the nose. When drawing the skin, I think it's best to start light and gradually increase the shadows in multiple layers. So as a base layer, I use an HB pencil and I draw tiny circles with a light hand. And I also kind of tilt the pencil a bit so that we won't use the sharp tip of the pencil, but rather the side of the pencil, as it will give a softer impression. And I like to begin with a forehead and gradually go down to prevent smudging anything out with my hand. Also remember to place a clean paper under your hand to prevent smudging. And as you can see, I'm mostly adding the color on the sides of the forehead and leaving some space in the center, because I don't want to make it too dark in the center right away, since the highlight is supposed to be there. After drawing the first layer, I grab a piece of tissue paper and softly blend everything out using circular motions. It's important to be light on your hand here, because I find that it makes the blending more even. And whenever you blend and approach an area that should be highlighted, you want to be even more careful so that you will get a nice transition between the shades. Then I draw a second layer using the same pencil. And just like before, I'm focusing more on filling in the sides of the forehead rather than the center. And when you shade the skin, it's important to pay attention to where your shadows and highlights are in the reference photo. So wherever the skin is lighter, you want to apply less color. And you can of course erase some of it with a kneaded eraser later on in case you accidentally make something look too dark. But it's still best to not add too much from the beginning, since the more and darker layers that you make, the more difficult it may be to erase. So after blending out that second layer, I move on with a 2B pencil, which is slightly darker than the HB pencil. And with this pencil, I focus mainly on adding color to the outer parts of the forehead, and then I blend this as well. And in case you blend so much that the outline of any facial feature fades out, make sure to draw it back in. And when you want to blend a smaller area, you can use a Q-tip instead of the tissue paper. However, as you can see me doing right here, I first used the Q-tip and now I'm using the tissue paper again, just to soften out the blend a little bit. And I don't finish the forehead completely, because sometimes it's easier to draw something else and see what the forehead looks like in relation to that other part. So as you can see, I moved back to the HB pencil and I'm starting to fill in the skin around the eyes and a little bit on the side of the nose bridge. And yeah, when blending smaller parts of the face, you can use a Q-tip, as I mentioned, or you can use a blending stump. The difference is that a Q-tip gives a softer blend than the blending stump. And as you can see, I also use a kneaded eraser to erase where I put a bit too much color. And I also want to point out that where you draw shadows around the eye, will depend on the person's eye shape and the lighting and so on. So just look at your reference photo and see where it's darker and where it's lighter and go from there. Still using the HB pencil, I then move on to the cheek and I make 2 layers, where in the second layer I focus mainly on the shadow that is under the cheekbone. And the cheeks may also have different shading depending on the lighting. So in this reference photo, the cheek has more shadows and more definition on this side of the face, but on the other side there are not that many shadows. By the way, it can be good to zoom in on your reference photo because sometimes you notice details and smaller shadows that you don't see when you have everything zoomed out. And that's actually the reason why my shadows may look slightly darker than on the photo. So after making 2 layers with the HB pencil, I take the 2B pencil and increase the shadow. And as you can see, I alternate between the different blending tools that I have, and this is because the tissue paper gives the softest blend but can sometimes be too much if you don't want to blend it out too far. So if you see that the shades have a softer transition in your reference photo, I would use this tissue paper unless the area is way too small. Then I would use the Q-tip. However, the Q-tip is also good to use if the transition is soft but not too soft. And the blending stump is better to use when the shadow is sharper. But if you don't have a blending stump, the Q-tip will work just fine. And as you can see, when I'm starting with the nose, I don't use a pencil at first, I use the blending tools instead. You can of course start with the HB pencil if you want, but if your Q-tip is a bit dirty, it's great to use when you are scared to add too much color all at once. When shading the nose, you want to use the same principles as I've described before. So look at the reference photo to see where the shadows and the highlights are and draw them accordingly. Usually the lower center part of the nose has a shadow in a V-like shape, as you can see me doing here. And just like before, I start with the HB pencil, then I move to the 2B pencil where everything is a bit darker, which is usually by the nostrils. And when you will see me shading the rest of the nose, I will primarily use the HB pencil, just because in the reference photo I don't think that there are that many intense shadows in the nose area, so we don't want to make it too dark. You want to continue filling in the other side of the nose like I'm doing, either with blending tools or the HB pencil. Then there's usually a highlight right at the tip of the nose, so I make a soft shadow above and around. And to really accentuate the highlight on the tip of the nose, I use the kneaded eraser. There's also usually a small highlight in the center of the bridge of the nose, so you want to apply more shadows on the sides and leave a bit of space in the center. You can of course also use the kneaded eraser in the center to accentuate the highlights in this area as well. But if you accidentally make the lines too harsh between the highlighted area that you created with the kneaded eraser and the shadow, then you can just use the Q-tip to soften out the edges a little bit. I then do a second layer where I focus mainly on the areas that are darker, and as you can see, there's also a slight shadow on the cheek right next to the bridge of the nose. And it's not very visible in this reference photo, but there's also a shadow that is sort of behind the nostril. It's a bit difficult to explain, but it's basically just like I'm drawing here. Anyways, now I'm just building up that V-shaped shadow. And also remember that if you think it's going too fast, you can slow the video down in the settings. In some cases, the sides of the nostrils are completely dark due to the lighting, but they can also be dark only on the sides, but then not as much in the middle, just as you can see me doing here on this side of the nose. And as you could see here, I used the blending stump, and now I'm using the Q-tip to soften out that blending I made, because sometimes when you blend you just realize that yeah, it was too much, but you can always use the Q-tip to make it softer, just as you can use the tissue paper also to make it softer after, for instance, using the Q-tip. And in the reference photo, you can also see that the shadow that is under the eyebrow sort of goes down and connects to the nose bridge, so that's what I'm doing right here. And for the Cupid's bow, as you can see, I'm making kind of like an oval shape where everything is lighter in the center and darker at the edges. And in the end, I just intensify the shadows wherever it's needed. I also take the 2B pencil again to intensify the shadows in the nostrils. Don't forget that there is also a shadow under the nose that connects to the Cupid's bow. Yeah, and I guess I will just speed it up a bit more now, because at this point I'm just intensifying the shadows. I'm not really doing anything new other than that, so I will talk again once I do something new that I need to explain. For this next step, you can either use a sharp 2H pencil or a very fine mechanical pencil and draw some small freckles. You want to be light on your hand and draw tiny circles that you fill in. I may not draw them in the exact places as they are in the reference photo, and you don't need to do that either if you feel like that's too difficult, but do it approximately. We then want to move on to the next side of the face by doing the exact same thing. So I draw the skin around the eye by first making a few layers with the HB pencil and paying more attention to the shadows. By the way, I also want to point out that in the next part of this series we are going to draw the eyes, so we don't have to finish drawing the skin around the eyes just now. It can actually be a bit easier to do it once we draw the eyes, since after you fill in the inside of the eye, you may notice that the skin around it needs more definition, because as I said, sometimes it's good to draw something else just to see how one part of the face will look in relation to another part. And now that I'm drawing this side of the face, I see how it looks in relation to the other side. So as you can see, this side I filled in some shadows because it looked a bit too light in relation to the other side. So yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So when you draw one area and then go on to the next, you may need to go back to the previous area just because, yeah, you see things in relation to other things. And remember that on this side of the cheek, there is not a prominent shadow under the cheekbones like on the other side. So we want to be careful when we shade here. I mean, we still want to make a shadow, just not as intense. And you can see in the video exactly where I apply the shadows and where I leave space for the lighter areas. And now that we have finished drawing both cheeks, we can go back and slightly increase some of the shadows around the eyes with the 2B pencil. But the rest we will do in the next video. I then grab a 6B pencil to increase the shadows in the nostril area. Then we can move on to the chin. And here the shadows usually lie right under the lips. Then there's usually a highlight right under that shadow. And then there's a softer shadow under that highlight. I also added some extra shadows around the lips, as you can see, but this we can also fix when we draw the lips in part 4. Also, don't forget to create a shadow at the lower part by the outline of the chin. After we have filled in the entire face with shadows, we can just add more shadows wherever we want. But just as with anything else that I have mentioned, we can add more shadows when we have gotten further on the drawing and we see what the skin looks like in relation to everything else. We also don't want to forget to fill in the ears. However, since you can barely see them in the photo as they are covered by hair, I don't try to make them extra pretty or anything because, yeah, we will cover most of them with hair anyway in the last part. After drawing the ears, I went back to adding more shadows wherever it was needed. I also added some more freckles on the cheeks with the 2H pencil, as you will see in the end, using the same technique as I described before. Anyways, the takeaway from this video is basically to start light and add more shadows gradually according to where the shadows and the highlights are in the reference photo. And between each layer, you want to blend everything out. And yeah, that's actually it for this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the upcoming parts. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video.